Hi, with luck you can see my slides. It's great to be back at GTC, where I'm still a fellow emeritus for whatever purpose that actually serves, but I like to keep in touch with the home college. And as I say, it's great to be there, even if I'm based at China, and it's on China's domestic policy that I want to focus this morning. Poverty in China has been the basis of a movement. If you go back to the time of Mao, movements were supposedly triggered from the bottom and brought about a continuing revolution. The attack on poverty has been driven very much from the top. And last year, China, despite COVID, celebrated the eradication of extreme poverty in rural areas. So that's the eradication. And the question is what do we do now? It's worth thinking and reflecting and placing China in a global context. To recognize that as a globe, we've been relatively successful over the last 30 years or so in terms of reducing poverty. Poverty here measured in terms of income of less than $1.90 a day. And it's reduced over that time from well over a quarter to about 1/10 of the world's population. COVID would have pushed that up somewhat, but nevertheless, it's a substantial achievement. But set against the successes of China, it disappears and becomes rather modest. So in 1990, 2/3 of the Chinese population would count as poor under that United Nations definition of poverty. And we've now, as I said, all but eradicated that. Well, how has that been done? Well, back in 1994, we have the first statement, the first direct policy to recognize that poverty exists, that it's something separate from the experience of the entire population. And it was very much focused on basics, on food. But really, poverty alleviation policy did not really begin until 2011 under Chairman Hu. And Hu Jintao talked about two no worries: enough food, enough housing, and 3 guarantees. That was a guarantee to education, guarantee to medical treatment, and a guarantee to housing. And that sort of multi-dimensional concept of poverty has driven policy in subsequent years. At the time, they began with a measure of a poverty threshold much higher than in previous times, and sought to equate in some way with that 190 definition, which had just about that period of time been announced by the United Nations as a sensible measure to use for developing countries. But that initiative only lasted a year. Chairman Xi Jinping arrived, and poverty alleviation was lost in his vision of Chairman Xi, which is to turn China into a moderately prosperous society. And so everything went quiet on the poverty front until, for some reason, which I'm not clear about, in 2015, poverty was once again discovered as an important policy goal. And that's the point at which it turned very much into a movement that was led with a figurehead of Chairman Xi, statements virtually every week about the attempt to eradicate poverty. By 2020, which was just what Chairman Hu had established back in 2011. And as I indicated already, the end of 2020, China claimed to have lifted the very last person out of poverty in the province of Gansu. I was sort of there to see that, or at least to hear it announced, if not to see the person transformed from being poor to not being poor. That is a trend of decline, and this is where poverty alleviation began. And so what you can see very clearly from that side is that much of the success of poverty alleviation was achieved before a specific poverty alleviation policy was put in place. Economic growth is, of course, the answer. It was through economic growth, lifting the incomes of everybody meant that people were lifted out of poverty rather naturally, not requiring specific targeted policies. But having said that, even to think about the restatement of poverty as a goal in 2015, to eliminate it would have required China to lift 36,000 people out of poverty every single day. And that is effectively what it has succeeded in doing, lifting a small market town out of poverty on a daily basis, 360 or so a year. And it has achieved that through a whole series of coordinated policies, operating nationally. We've mentioned economic growth. Infrastructure development has been crucially important too. So 38,000 kilometres of high-speed rail network has been put in place since 2007. We're trying to be put HS2 in place since 2009. There's been provincial initiatives, spatial targeting, identifying counties that were requiring particular need, a great attempt to invest in human capital, improving education provision, operating to a township level as we go down from nation to village, with focus particularly in the last 5 years on e-commerce as a way of lifting individuals out of poverty, letting them sell their produce, for example, directly on the internet. Social assistance, cash benefits put in place for people in state of need. And similar sort of policies operated at the village level. The village still being conceptually very important in China, and in practical terms, the place where democracy is most evident. But alongside those hierarchical strategies, we've had clear policy targets, the eradication of poverty, strong political leadership. I've underlined the importance of Chairman Xi, almost a part of the personality cult in terms of Xi being seen to do something positive for everybody. Precision targeting. In 2016, surveys were run, in fact, censuses were run to identify every single family that was poor, according to China's definition. And it's that document that has led to the basis of saying, we have eradicated poverty. We have taken everybody off that list. They are no longer poor, according to those criteria. To facilitate that precision targeting, 775,000 civil servants were given additional responsibilities to lift a number of named individuals out of poverty. Sunday came to be called Xi Day. That was the day these officials went to the villages to work with the villagers to lift their named individuals out of poverty. But what China's also done and can do so well is to mobilize society. So firms, prosperous large firms in the east, which is the more prosperous part of China, adopted startup companies in the west and gave them technical and professional and managerial support. The same happened at the level of governance. So prosperous cities on the west built pacts with poor villages on the west, and a whole mobilization process was put in place to lift these 36,000 people a day out of poverty. So let's think about these achievements. Here's the national poverty line. 2012, we were about 10%. Poverty rate here is the national poverty rate, and the scale is logarithmic to try and capture the incredibly substantial reduction that has been achieved. So that's a national figure. Here is the US poverty definition, the United Nations poverty definition, the one we were talking about before. China's poverty line is above that, and you can see by 2015, we were down to less than 1%. Rural poverty rate is higher. The urban poverty rate is much lower. People migrate from rural areas to escape poverty and live in probably relative poverty, but live in a sense a more prosperous life within the cities. So these are the measures that we have been focusing on, measures which effectively point to the eradication of poverty in 2020. When these poverty goals were put in place, China was a low-income country. It no longer is. The standard for low middle-income countries of poverty is $3.20 a day, according to the World Bank, United Nations. High middle-income countries, which strictly speaking is where China was in about 2012, 2013. You're talking about $550 a day. So that in 2016, rather than having a very small number, you've got almost a quarter of the Chinese population living in poverty. So where do we go from here? Here is a bar chart showing, comparing China's poverty rates with that of other countries. If we compare China with comparable countries, upper middle income countries, we see that China is slightly ahead of trend, but has a considerable number of people on the margins of poverty. But when you look not horizontally, but you to look to the future, China has a high income country, which is where the World Bank expects it to be within the next 5 years. You can see an incredible gap. Measured as $5.50 a day, high income countries, it's virtually non-existent. But in China, we're still talking about a quarter of the population. So to bridge this gap, China is moving from an absolute definition of poverty about survival to a relative definition of poverty about engagement in the broader society. Well, where do they set that line? One of the problems with relative poverty is that it's much more difficult to get rid of. Europe, Britain, has focused on relative poverty for 20, 25 years. Europe has had a campaign to reduce relative poverty since 2020. And as you can see on this measure where you're setting your poverty line as 40% of average earnings or average incomes, you can see that poverty is horizontal in Europe. In China, poverty measured this way has actually increased, not fallen as we saw in absolute terms. And if you raise the threshold a bit higher to 60% of median earnings, again, Europe has rather failed to address the problem. In China, it's got worse. So, thinking about China, what's its new target going to be? How is it going to measure relative poverty? One strategy, which is the strategy that has begun to be used by cities in China, is to look down, to say that social assistance, called dibao in China, is not adequate enough, particularly to live in cities. We need to raise the threshold. Average rural dibao operates at something like $1.16 a day. On that sort of measure, we're talking about 53 million people who are poor. If we go to Hubei, a province around South Centre, they have set a poverty line about twice that poverty line. That's, of course, going to increase the number of people who count as poor. And that becomes a political embarrassing problem. If we go to Wuhan, which we're all now familiar with, a major city within the province of Hubei, we can see that they have a low income line, twice that for the province as a whole. And on this criteria, we're talking about 320 million people who count as poor. 320 million people becomes the target that we have to reduce. But in Europe, we've not looked to the bottom and improving upwards. We've said relative poverty is about people's ability to participate in society as a whole. We need to look up towards average or median incomes. If we take 40% of median incomes, we're not quite sure how many people that represents. If we take 50%, we reckon that it's 300 or so million. If we take 60, it takes us up to 400 million. These are big differences and big problems. 400 million is what? 29%, getting on for the third of the Chinese population, who still count as poor, according to criteria that we, as a high-income country, take naturally as where we stick our poverty line, where we set our poverty line. China is very heterogeneous. It's richish in the east, it's poor in the south, and it's poorer still in the west. So do we go for a national poverty line, or do we set poverty lines which reflect those differences in living standards between the city and the rural area? If we go for the national line and we want to set our poverty threshold at 40% of median disposable income, that means we have to raise the poverty line by a factor of something like 4. If we go to 60%, you're increasing it by a factor of 6. Urban EBA, it's a factor of about 1.5. 2.5 if we go and equate with the poverty line that we set here in the UK. If we have separate poverty lines focused for rural areas, the median for rural areas, fix our poverty line in relation to that, then our multiplier is less. That means we have to spend less, but it also means more people remain poor. So, what strategies does China need to put in place to achieve this goal? I think that strong political leadership needs to continue. I think we need to recognise that poverty in China is mostly structural. The big debate in China, as in the UK, is how much poverty is caused by personal failure, for laziness, for example. It's broadly speaking structural. I think we need to think about poverty as an element of all policies, to mainstream poverty across all policies, through taxes, through urban development and the like. But if poverty, relative poverty, unlike absolute poverty, cannot be solved through economic growth, but only through redistribution, then we have to mobilise the middle class, who enjoyed watching poverty fall, but weren't directly affected by its impact on their living standards. They will have to in future. And we need to fix poverty policy targets. As yet, we're still struggling with definitions. In terms of policy design, we have to redistribute income. We have to tackle the big differences between urban and rural poverty and acknowledge that in future we will address urban poverty, whereas in the past we've only focused on rural areas. We're going to need to enhance universal social security provision to build human capital through training and retraining, and probably not to focus on individual poverty alleviation measures, but to recognise target groups. Elders is the fastest growing group in poverty. Children experience more poverty than others. Disability, gender, and very possibly ethnic minorities, of which there are 56, I think, official ethnic minorities in China, are groups that we need to think about specifically. If that's the policy agenda that I'm recommending, what chance is there of getting it in place? I don't know. I've been in China now 3 years. I still don't know how the policy system works. But there's the man who matters. That's Premier Li. Chairman Xi talks about policy, talks to the world. Premier Li makes poverty happen as head of the State Council. That's me, 3 places away. He did listen. Whether he remembered is a much more different question. As I say, I don't know how the intricacies of policy making work within China. I'm on the fringe, but I'm exceedingly excited by living in a country that believes it can do things and actually does. If you're interested in the talk and want more detail, the International Labour Organization has published a paper, which I did with my colleague Yang Lichao, and that's available. And in China, it's New Year's Day. So happy Lunar New Year to you all. Thank you.